hearing me okay? Okay, thank you. So Bob and I prepared our presentations independently. I think they overlap pretty nicely, but I'm going to go through parts of mine pretty quickly. Bob is a specialist when it comes to oil and commodities for amperage. I am not. My expertise is in organizing response to spills of oil. But to do that, you need to have some basic understanding of how oil behaves in the environment. So obviously, oil's been around for a long time. It's ubiquitous, and there are many different types of oil, as Bob described. When oil is discharged into the environment, there's this continuum that gets initiated, and this continuum is on a timeline, and it's about weathering, as Bob described. And weathering is described as resulting from oil's exposure to the environment. It begins immediately, and it continues indefinitely, but at different rates. So one of the initial, this slide depicts the various elements of weathering. So you've got a spreading phenomenon, you've got photooxidation that occurs, you've got evaporation, as Bob mentioned, emulsification, which is the mixing of different types of liquids, namely oil and water. Dispersion is another element of weathering over here. Biodegradation is an element that we consider in the context of cleaning up oil spills. And as Bob mentioned, sedimentation is also a very key aspect of it. So again, the weathering processes: spreading, evaporation, dispersion, dissolution, oxidation, emulsification, sedimentation, and degradation. So spreading, what is spreading? Well, when oil is discharged, let's say from a pipe at the bottom of a water body, then as the oil releases, it comes up to the surface and it spreads out on the surface of the water. So that's an example of spreading. Evaporation, as Bob mentioned, with some types of oils, up to 30% may evaporate within the first few hours and days following a spill. And what that does when it evaporates is let me back up a minute. So right now you see, on this slide, you see all the oil on the surface is pretty heavy, and then when the evaporation occurs, it becomes, the oil on the top, before it begins to evaporate, has a certain specific gravity. It becomes heavier as the lighter stuff begins to evaporate and volatilize, and has more of a tendency to sink eventually in conjunction with other weathering processes. And that tendency to evaporate is influenced by these elements or these factors, variables such as air, water temperature, turbulence, wind, and spreading rate. Dispersion, basically oil that's on the surface that begins to, as it spreads out, it becomes less thick, if you will. So instead of being what we call product, it becomes a sheen, or a rainbow sheen, or a silver sheen. There are different gradations of sheens. Emulsification. This occurs when oil and water mix. They are, you get emulsifications that are caused by wave action, by wind. In the case of rivers, for example, in the Kalamazoo River, when we had the 2010 spill, all of that oil that was spilled, that approximately 1 million gallons of oil, went over a series of dams. And when it goes over dams, it's mixed up and there's a lot of turbulence. The same thing occurs in rapid rivers with lots of rapid flow, you get a lot of mixing, and you can get emulsification as well as sedimentation. These are different types of emulsifications. Again, ultimately, and Mike Popa with TNT Marine will talk more about this later when he talks about recovery and containment techniques. Ultimately, we have to deal with these emulsifications when it comes to cleanup in some cases. Sedimentation is a big one that you've all heard lots about over the last 5 years, especially in the context of the Kalamazoo River, because some of that oil at the end of its weathering cycle sank to the bottom of the river and became involved with the sediments. Not most of it, some of it. Most of it was recovered early in response before the weathering continuum progressed to the point where it was primarily a sedimentation issue. But anyway, sedimentation is something that we are concerned with. Biodegradation is another form of weathering. So you've got warm water, you've got organisms, microorganisms in the water that interact with the oil, and they consume the oil. So I know that in this room there's a lot of preoccupation with Enbridge 185, in particular the stage crossing. It's not the only pipeline in northern Michigan. Bob mentioned that there's another pipeline system south of here. It's run by a company called Mark West. It operates what is known as the Michigan crude oil gathering network. And oil can be spilled into rivers as well. And when we who do response and preparedness work here in northern Michigan, yeah, we worry about Line 5, we worry about the Straits crossing, we worry about the rivers that Line 5 crosses as well, in the UT as well as in the Lower Peninsula. We worry about the water crossings associated with the Mark West pipeline. So in open water, oil behaves one way. In rivers, it's a different story, or it can be a different story, depending upon the circumstances of the spill. This slide depicts how weathering contributes to the sinking of oil, in this case a heavy oil, and this is a slide that I've taken out of some of our Kalamazoo River presentations, and it depicts this concept of, in this case, a heavy oil on the top of the river, something with a specific gravity very close to that of water, which floats when it's filled, but it barely floats. And as it weathers via turbulence and going over dams or being battered around by floodwaters, etc., it begins to sink and becomes associated with the sediments, in which case you end up with a cleanup challenge of having to recover oil that's on the bottom of the river. So, Renetta, where are you? I'm good? Okay. So, all of this talk about weathering, for me, from my perspective, goes to what I call the response continuum. Your recovery effectiveness, your ability to be successful in recovering oil, is influenced and limited by weathering. And it's optimized by the extent to which you are prepared to respond and the extent to which you have adequate resources to respond and the extent to which you are organized to respond. So if we go back to this weathering continuum kind of predicts the recovery, the response continuum, if you will. When oil is spilled, your opportunities to recover it successfully are here, early, before all of this weathering occurs. Because as the weathering occurs, the oil is no longer readily available to be recovered. In some cases, you can still recover it, but you might do as much damage to the environment in the process of recovering it as the oil itself is doing. So the moral here is be prepared to get it early, before the weathering takes it to the bottom or mixes it with other media. This slide is put in here to project some of the scientific complexities that are associated with figuring out how to recover oil as it goes through this weathering process. So some of the things we think about are aquatic toxicity. We think about the chemistry of the oil. In rivers, we think about how sediment is transported and how rivers behave. In sunken oil or submerged oil scenarios, we have experts that we bring to talk to us about that. We have other experts who specialize in biodegradability. Ecological risk assessment is a factor, and safe and transport expertise is something that we bring to bear. And we do that by bringing together groups of scientists onto a team, if you will, who advise the decision makers. In the case of an EPA or a Coast Guard-led spill, this would be a federal on-sea coordinator. And we use contribution from these scientific disciplines to develop our endpoints. How far are we going to go with this? And at the end of the day, it's about what we call net environmental benefit. Again, you have to early on, you can usually get a lot of oil in many situations. In the case of the Kalamazoo River spill, within the first few weeks of the spill, of that reported 843,000 gallons that was spilled, we recovered 766,000 gallons by using conventional techniques, because we got to it before it sank. We got to it using booming and containment and excavation. And we did it without doing a lot of damage. Okay. But eventually you reach a point where you got to do a cost-benefit analysis in terms of how much damage you do in the process of trying to clean it up versus what the damage is for just leaving it in place. So that's what this slide kind of shows. You've got the risks of residual oil associated with the risks of removal. So you got this back and forth debate that you have. And you got to eventually end up just drawing the line and saying, okay, this is where we're going to stop because we're not doing any good anymore. So the conclusions are, get organized quickly, respond assertively because the clock is running, or even aggressively, and get it while it's available. That's basically what you're trying to do in a response scenario. And then you bring science to help you establish those endpoints. So that's my thing about fate and transport in the context of response.
Thank you, Ralph.